Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar on the topic of the future of international organisations. This is webinar 4 in our series, and as a follow-up, we'll send you a link to the recordings of the previous 3 sessions should you wish to go back and look at those. Just a few points of housekeeping before we make a start. Just to let you know that you will be automatically muted. That's just so that we can maintain the quality of the recording. And that's because obviously we will be recording today's session, and that's really so that anybody who was unable to attend today has the opportunity to see a follow-up of the session. As you will be muted, we would encourage you to type any questions into the questions or the chat boxes, which you'll find in the right-hand panel on your screen. And we'll take a couple of pauses throughout the session to come to these as and when it's a good time for a break. So that's all it is really from me. So without further ado, I will pass you over to the host of our webinar this morning.
Good morning. My name is Hilke Dijkstra. I'm from Maastricht University. I'm happy that you could join us on what here in Maastricht is a very sunny day. I'm the co-author of this textbook on international organizations. You may be familiar with this textbook or not, and that really doesn't matter for today because we're going to be talking about the future of international organizations. Now, obviously, that's always a bit speculative when you're talking about the future, so I'm trying to keep it a bit open. I'm trying to keep it a bit short, and I very much encourage your questions about current challenges that international organizations may face so that we can have an open discussion. So feel free, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat box. At specific moments during this webinar, I'm going to pause for a moment, going to see whether there are any questions, and I'm going to try to answer them as best as possible. So let me just go to the next slide. So this is the agenda for today's webinar. As noted before by Amanda, this is the 4th webinar. So in the first webinar, we looked at the theory and history of international organizations. In the second webinar, we looked at the policy making of international organizations. In the third webinar, we looked at the activities of international organizations. And now we're going to be trying to draw some conclusion on the basis of all of that, and indeed look forward to the future of international organizations. Now, as you know, international organizations are currently really in crisis. There are a number of states withdrawing from international organizations. States are halting funding for international organizations. So we can really talk about a crisis of multilateralism, a crisis of international organizations. Now, I've put on the slide some logos of some of the most well-known international organizations, and indeed all of them are in crisis. The European Union is obviously facing the withdrawal of the United Kingdom. NATO's Article 5, the collective defense article of NATO, was called into question by Donald Trump. The Trump administration has refused to appoint judges to the appellate body of the World Trade Organization. The Trump administration is also halting funding for the World Health Organization and has withdrawn from UNESCO in Paris. A number of countries like Burundi and the Philippines have withdrawn from the International Criminal Court. So we can really say that international organizations as we know them are under challenge, and that states are no longer always happy with their performance, creating demands for these international organizations, and indeed halting funding, blocking resources, and in the worst case, even withdrawing. Something that really raises a question for us: is there still a future for international organizations, and how are they responding? Let me first talk a bit about the challenges to international organizations. Now, in the book and also in my first webinar, I talked about 3 conditions that are important behind the creation of international organizations over the last 200 years. This is not necessarily about the current challenges, but over time we have identified 3 conditions that are important for international organizations to be created and to make a good contribution to the international politics. Now, these 3 conditions are the problem condition, the cognitive condition, and the hegemonic condition. The problem condition is that international organizations try to address cross-border problems, international problems. The cognitive condition is that states and other actors recognize that international organizations are the best possible organizations to address these problems. And the hegemonic condition is that there's a hegemon, a big member state that's willing to carry some of the cooperation cost within international organizations. Now, the argument has really been in our first webinar that if you have all three conditions, if all three conditions are right, you might see the creation of international organizations. So for instance, if there is an international problem, for instance, navigation on the River Rhine, and if there is a recognition that an international organization could perhaps best regulate navigation on the River Rhine, and if there are some hegemonic states that are willing to carry the cost of navigation on the River Rhine, for instance, France, you see the establishment of an international organization, and that's what happened in the early 19th century, the creation of the Rhine River Commission. Now, while these three conditions very nicely explain why international organizations have been created, my argument today is that they also help to explain us why international organizations now are under many challenges. Indeed, all these three conditions are currently challenged. There is a question about the problems that international organizations address. There's a question on whether states and other actors still think that international organizations are effective in addressing these problems. And there's obviously a hegemonic transition from the United States to other powers in the world. So let me just take all these conditions one by one to give you a better sense of what really the challenges of international organizations are these days. So let's start with the problem condition. The idea here is that international organizations can address cross-border and international problems. Yet international problems have become a lot harder over the years. They're more scientifically complex. International problems now are cross-cutting through society. So it's not just about navigation on the River Rhine, it's about real big things that are important to all sorts of aspects of society. And there are many more actors involved. The number of states internationally has grown tremendously over the last 70 years since the end of the Second World War. There are now non-governmental organizations, there are lobby groups, there are civil society actors. So to solve problems has become a lot harder. And let me just give you a number of examples. International organizations and international regimes were very effective in addressing the problem of the so-called hole in the ozone layer. So this went back to the 1980s. Scientific evidence showed that there was a hole in the ozone layer, and the way to deal with it was to ban a number of specific chemicals from circulation and production. Now, there were not many countries that were actually producing these chemicals, so these countries made a commitment to reduce the production of these chemicals, and as a result, the problem with the ozone layer has been largely addressed. Now, that was a very specific problem with a specific solution, and states were effective in doing that. But think of climate change. Climate change is not just about banning one or two chemicals. Climate change is about really reorganizing our entire society with all states in the world. And climate change is no longer about the United States making an agreement with European countries and perhaps Japan. No, climate change now also involves China and India, and rainforest discussions in Brazil. So much more difficult problem to address, a much harder problem than the specific issue of the ozone layer. And there are examples across other policy domains as well. Trade policy, for instance, used to be about reducing tariffs. You reduce the tariffs on goods a little bit. But these days, discussions in the World Trade Organization are very much also about regulating international property right, or measures against social dumping. So that really goes further than just reducing tariffs along the border. Think also about keeping peace and security. In the past, peacekeeping under the UN was mostly making sure that states didn't go to war with each other. But these days, peacekeeping very much is about addressing problems of civil wars. Now, it's possible to negotiate a peace agreement between two formally recognized leaders of states. It's a lot more difficult to negotiate peace agreements and keep the peace between rebel groups and in the fragility of generally of civil wars. So on the whole, the problems have become a lot more difficult, and that raises questions whether international organizations can indeed solve those problems. So I think that's the first condition, first challenge to international organizations that we see it. The problems we see today are more difficult than the problems international organizations dealt with 20 or 30 years ago. Let me then move on to the next condition, the cognitive condition. The idea always was that the moment that states and other actors recognize that international organizations are the ones that can address problems, international organizations are being set up. But the really effectiveness and legitimacy of international organizations currently being challenged. On the picture, you see protesters at the Hamburg G20 summit only a couple of years back, really questioning the liberal agenda of international organizations, but also the effectiveness of international organizations to achieve results. So these days, it's no longer that obvious that if you have an international problem, you need an international solution, and you need an international organization. That very basis behind the need of international organizations is currently being challenged. And what you see here is that the formal international organizations as we know them, the European Union, the World Trade Organization, International Criminal Court, UN, and so forth, are no longer the default option for cooperation. We see a whole series of informal international organizations. We see bilateral agreements. We see international non-governmental organizations coming up. We see forms of private authority and regulation, network governance. So it's no longer clear that states immediately go to international organizations if they encounter international problems, because the perception is that international organizations might not necessarily be effective enough or have the legitimacy to solve these problems. So also that perception is being challenged. Now, finally, I'd like to talk about the hegemonic condition. What you very often see is that international cooperation yields benefits for all actors involved, but there are some costs as well of cooperation, and somebody should be willing to pay for those costs to the greater benefit of all involved parties. Now, obviously, the United States has done a lot of that in the post-Second World War period in the last 70 years. It has often paid simply for the bill of international organizations. It has often, brought countries together, putting even, its own reputation at risk. And I think what we've seen is the end of unipolarity in the last decade or so. The US is not willing to pick up the bill anymore, and nobody else is currently doing. Indeed, we're living in a leaderless world. There is no longer strong international coordination, previously run by the United States, and there's actually very limited impetus of the United States. Think about the current corona crisis. It's not as if the Trump administration is bringing the world community together. We also see that China and other emerging powers are really reluctant to step up. They're doing things in the current corona crisis, China particularly, but it's not, taking a leadership role. And we see all sorts of half-hearted attempts by Europe. So in that sense, there's not really a hegemon supporting the present international organizations, picking up the bill, even if it costs a little bit, bringing a bit of leadership to international organizations. So also on that third condition, international organizations don't get the support they got in previous times. So all sorts of challenges to international organizations. Before I am going to be talking about the resilience of international organizations, because I do indeed think that international organizations are weathering the storm pretty well, contrary to some popular beliefs. I'm wondering whether there are any questions at this point.
Let's just have a quick look if anything's come through. I can't see any at the moment, so perhaps if you just wanted to go on to the next section, but obviously if anyone on the line does have any questions, please feel free to type those and we can come back to them slightly later on.
Okay, I think that's a very good idea. So let's talk a bit about the resilience of international organizations. Now, I bring a slide back from the very first webinar where I talked about the number of international organizations over time. And we defined international organizations having 3 or more member states, a plenary meeting every 10 years, and a secretariat correspondence address. So you'll find that definition on the slide. And on this basis, we've identified a big 500 international organizations, of which a big 300 are still alive, and thus we come to the conclusion that 200 international organizations have failed over time, which means that they have died, been dissolved, replaced or integrated in other international organizations. So overall, about 37% of international organizations have failed, are no longer with us. And an important bit of this has been really taking place over the last 20 years or so. Since the 1990s, you see the growth of international organizations on the graph, but something has happened since the early 1990s. We no longer see an increase of international organizations. Now, what me and my team of scholars in MASIT have done is we've really started studying, what's going on. Why do international organizations sometimes die or get dissolved? Why do they get replaced, integrated by others? And what has been going on in the last 20 years or so. And we're thinking that by looking at this historical record, we can say some sensible things about whether the current challenges on international organizations mean they still have a future, and how we can move forward from the current crisis of liberal international order. And so in this little section, I'm going to do a step back. I'm going to look a bit at the history of why international organizations failed in the past, and then I'm going to be looking forward. And my main message here is that actually, even though international organizations are sometimes dissolved, the major one, the household ones, the ones we know, like the World Health Organization, the European Union, the United Nations, they are actually really quite resilient. They stand up and they often survive the test of time. So let's have a look a bit at the evidence. So I've put here on the slide in the first row the 534 international organizations. And we analyzed that about 140 of those have died. So 26% of international organizations have died, and I encircled that in red. That means that another 11% to get to the 37% have been replaced and integrated, but I won't be looking at those for a moment. But what's important is to split out these international organizations, consider them not all the same, because comparing these 500 might be like apples and oranges. So what we've really done is we've looked at the major international organizations, for instance, that have a very large membership, a lot of member states, or international organizations that have high levels of institutionalization, like an international court, or international organizations that have very large administrative resources, for instance, that 50 or 100 people work for these international organizations. And what we have been doing is really think about, are these international organizations equally at risk? So the big international organizations like the United Nations that have a large membership, or the European Union that has strong international courts, or the World Health Organization, which has a big administrative resources, a lot of doctors and expertise. Are these organizations equally at risk compared to a lot of the smaller ones? And the answer is no. In fact, the 11 international organizations that we know of that have a large membership, high institutionalization, and large resources, not a single one has died of them. 0%, the last row. And even international organizations that have a large membership, high institutionalization, or large resources, so only one of the 3 criteria, only 11% of them have died. So what we get from this picture is that international organizations that are major, that are well known, the household names, that they are quite resilient, that they have faced a number of crises, financial crisis, economic crises, crisis of ideology in the 1980s, sometimes crisis of wars, and they have stuck around. So there's something about these bigger international organizations that really makes them quite resilient to these type of challenges. And that's also why we think me and my colleagues in MASID, that the future is a bit brighter for international organizations than it's often being portrayed, and that some of these international organizations will survive even if the United States cuts funding or leaves them. Actually, if you look closer at the US leaving a number of international organizations, they often come back as well. So we're quite convinced about the resilience of some of these bigger organizations. Nevertheless, some of the bigger international organizations have died over time, and it's very interesting to also look at those cases. So I've put on the slide here 6 big international organizations, you might have heard of them, that have died or that have been dissolved. These are the Council of Mutual Assistance, Comecon, which was the former trade bloc of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, which was the former security organization of the Soviet Union, the Western European Union, which used to be a security organization in Europe, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which was dispersing Marshall Aid funds after the Second World War, the International Refugee Organization, which helped the refugees after the Second World War. Obviously, after the Second World War, a lot of refugees all over Europe, and this organization was set up to help them get home. And finally, the League of Nations, perhaps the most famous example of an international organization that was dissolved. So these are really the 6 big international organizations that are no longer with us. And it's interesting to see their causes of death. They are really quite varied, from the fall of the Soviet Union to competition from the EU, and the end of Marshall Aid. Marshall assistance only lasted a couple of years after the Second World War. Once it's done, the organization obviously didn't necessarily have a rationale anymore. Same with the International Refugee Organization. Its mandate expired as well in 51, 52. And finally, the League of Nations, which saw a tremendous amount of divergence during the 1930s already, and then obviously with the Second World War. But what we thought was really interesting when looking at these 6 organizations is that even though these organizations have died, have been dissolved, they actually have developed some sort of an afterlife. Now, this is very obvious in the case of the League of Nations, for instance. The League of Nations was dissolved in 1946, but the United Nations then took over the functions of collective security, and the UN took over the buildings in Geneva, and about 200 officials who worked for the League of Nations then started working for the United Nations. So a senior British statesman even said, you know, the League of Nations died, long live the United Nations. So a clear continuity from the League of Nations into the UN. But this is actually really quite similar in other cases. And when the International Refugee Organization was disbanded, the country set up the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and it took over some of the functions and got part of the budget as well. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development took over staff and assets, including a very nice castle on the outskirts in Paris, from the Organization of European Economic Cooperation. And the EU similarly took over the functions and 2 of the agencies of the Western European Union. Actually, only with the Warsaw Treaty Organization and Comecon, we don't see so much continuity. The fall of the Soviet Union really meant essentially the end of these organizations. A small footnote there, a small caveat, is that a lot of Central and Eastern European countries which were under Comecon then started renegotiating trade agreements with the EU. So previously they were trading with the Soviet Union, and from 1992, 1993 onwards, they started trading with Western Europe. So that replaced essentially the free trade agreements under Comecon. So I think there's a lot of empirical material and a lot of data, but I think the key message here is that international organizations, the major ones, actually they don't die very often. So I think that's the big picture. They tend to be really quite resilient. But even if they die, in the case of these 6 organizations, very often cooperation continues in a different form under a different label. And so these type of international organizations have some sort of an afterlife, which once again is type of evidence that international organizations tend to be really quite resilient against external challenges. Now, before moving on to the next section, I just want to say a few more words precisely on this point, and also help to explain why international organizations over the last 200 years have been quite resilient. And I think what's important with major international organizations is that they fulfill important functions. So obviously, the Second World War stopped the League of Nations from operating. But the very fact that the Second World War broke out meant that states wanted to have a new forum for collective security in the United Nations. So it broke down cooperation in the League of Nations on the one hand, but at the same time, it very much underlined once again the rationale to have an international organization to deal with security. So major international organizations fulfill important functions. Even if you would, dissolve the European Union at some point, you're going to have a different type of organization that deals with trade, social, security relations between European states. So it's not too easy to actually think of a world without international organizations. What's also important is that member states very often heavily invest in these major international organizations. They set up important buildings, expensive buildings, they recruit staff that gets very specialized in addressing some of these international problems. So member states really make quite a heavy investment in them. They negotiate treaties, so it's not too easy to set up these major international organizations, which also makes it very difficult to replace them. And if you can't really replace international organizations, you'll probably deal with the devil you know, rather than trying to re-engineer international organizations. And finally, what we quite see is that some of these major international organizations have also secretariat staff working for them, secretary generals, directors, but also simple desk officers that do their best to keep their organization relevant when it comes to international problems. They do their best to stimulate cooperation between states and other actors. So you have a number of reasons really why international organizations have shown to be quite resilient over the last 200 years, even in light of big shocks like world wars, economic financial crises, domestic contestation, demonstrations, and so forth. Many major international organizations are still with us. And also that makes me positive that in light of current crises, they might have an important future ahead of them. Now, before really looking at the here and now, the current crisis of liberal international order, I would be keen to take a few questions.
Yes, we've had a couple come through. So someone's asking why other governments, for example, China, don't pick up the role as the leader within international organizations. This person is sort of asking, wouldn't that be an attractive option for international countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important and good question. I think in a way, some scholars have said that we're currently in an interregnum, so in between two kings or two queens, if you like, and that's a period of instability, and it's unclear who's in charge. I think what we've seen, particularly with China and its role in international organizations and global governance over the last 10 to 15 years, is that it has tried to be very constructive, moderate, making a useful contribution, trying not to block too many things, but at the same time also shying away from really stepping up and taking a leadership role. Now there are obviously a number of exceptions. I mean, China has worked hard to set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for instance, a new type of institution. It has worked on the BRICS Development Bank. The Belt and Road Initiative is obviously really quite an important step of increasing leadership of China in the world. But for instance, with the current discussions on the World Health Organization, with Trump halting funding, it's not that China is going to say, well, we'll just get our purse and make up for the difference, because I think China also very much realizes that would send a signal of China's taking over the shop, and I think they really want to avoid that. So I don't think we've seen China making billions available now for the World Health Organization, now that there's a funding gap from the United States. I think at the same time, one wonders why Europe has not stepped up a bit more aggressively. Obviously, there has been support for the World Health Organization. There have also been forces, well, Trump is half right on the World Health Organization. Some countries have increased their funding, but not necessarily the EU saying, well, we're in a big crisis, we're a big World Health crisis, whether you agree with the World Health Organization or not, we need to address this crisis first and then reform. So I think that's really missing from a number of actors, and I think one can explain that mostly that we're in a transitional phase. It's not necessarily clear who's in charge, and perhaps by demanding such a leading role, one also runs the risk of further upsetting the system.
Thank you. And another question's come through about the World Health Organization. This person's asking, saying that they see that China has been a leading sort of power within the World Health Organization. And so is it a good question to ask what it takes to become a replacement hegemon?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question to ask. What I'm sometimes wondering here is, whether the natural rise of China, to what extent that's being seen as a threat or a challenge by others. Because obviously, if your economy is growing quite quickly, if your military grows similarly, some other states will always be wondering, is this about a peaceful rise, or is this more aggressively? And I think that's a very difficult balance that China tries to master. I think taking over, big international organizations, demanding a leadership role in, say, the World Health Organization or the World Trade Organization would be interpreted as quite aggressive behavior by some Western states. Now, what I think is what we're seeing already is that China perhaps more on a regional level takes some initiatives. Now, this is obviously quite difficult for China as well, because many of the countries around China see an even bigger threat than we perhaps see from a European perspective, because they are obviously first concerned. But I think the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is an obvious example where China tries to do something initially for the region and takes a leadership role there. I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to be seeing more of those initiatives. The question then becomes, will those be organized via international organizations or more via bilateral initiatives? The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, in a sense, is an international organization like any other. It very much looks like the World Bank or any other regional investment bank or development bank. It's modeled after it in terms of governance, and it obviously also includes a lot of European countries. The Belt and Road Initiative, on the other hand, really doesn't look like an international organization. That's very much about bilateral relationships between China and other countries. So I think that's really an important question of which way are we heading. Will those initiatives follow the type of multilateral international organizations that the United States particularly Are there any other questions at this time?
No, there aren't any other questions at this time. We did just lose you there just for a second in terms of audio. So just to say that if you want to continue, and then if it continues, I might just turn off your webcam just in case that's sort of slowing down the process. But for the moment, let's just continue, I think.
Okay, well, I've talked a bit about the challenges to international organizations. I've talked about how they've shown tremendous resilience, particularly bigger ones, the household names, over the last 2 centuries. And I'd like to talk a bit about the current crisis of liberal international order. So let me move to the next slide. Because a lot of people are talking about the liberal international order, how it's essentially gone bankrupt, whether it's liberal, whether it's international, whether it's an order. And I think this is worth using as some sort of a analysis to also think about international organizations and their future. Now, a lot of people have been writing about the crisis of liberal international order over the last couple of years, and they seem to agree on one thing, that the sources of this crisis can really be traced to decisions made during the early and mid-1990s. So John Mearsheimer, for once, says that this was just a bound-to-fail experiment of liberals, and that they should have never set up all these global governance things, which were never going to work, and now the whole thing is coming down. So I think that's in a nutshell, John Mearsheimer's type of realist point. And John Ikenberry agrees that the sources of this crisis can be traced to the early 1990s, end of the Cold War, which really talks about the globalization of liberalism. So for him, the liberal international order used to be a very confined Western thing between the United States and some European countries, and suddenly, after the end of the Cold War, this became a global thing, where not just Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union need to be included, but also China now and all the other emerging countries, Africa, and so forth. And John Ikenberry sees a big challenge here. I mean, how can you expand such what was much more of a liberal regional type of order globally? So for him, that's where the challenge comes from. Michael Tsuren in Berlin provides an even different account. He says that since the 1990s, all sorts of international authority has been granted to international organizations, to global governance, and people, it now starts to affect people's lives. The European Union affects people's lives, the UN affects people's lives, the World Health Organization affects people's lives, and people start to contest that type of authority. And so Michael Tsuren sees a rise of international authority above the nation state, and automatically assumes that there's contestation as a result of it. So different sources for the current challenge of liberal international order. Now, obviously, these three writers and others see different type of consequences, but I think the starting point is typically dated early 1990s, which means that this is not necessarily a Trump phenomenon. Indeed, what we're currently seeing is a number of factors and symptoms of the crisis of liberal international order. We see the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of populism, rule of law crises in the Western world, from Hungary, Poland to Brazil, if you like. Emerging powers, and China is part of this equation, election of Trump, Brexit vote. So there are a lot of symptoms, a lot of factors contributing to the current crises, and all of these things are currently really coming together. So I think this is, in a nutshell, the current discussion on the crisis of liberal international order, which is dominating most academic journals on international relations, many foreign policy journals as well. Now, let's have a bit further look at these things and how international organizations play out. Because obviously the liberal international order is one thing, international organizations are part of that, but they're not the same. And I think what's important here when talking about the future of international organizations is to distinguish between international organizations and multilateralism. Now, international organizations, in a very narrow definition, are about solving problems between states. So this is states having a cooperation problem, and they're creating an international treaty, an international agreement to deal with that problem, and they put an international organization on top of it to look for compliance with an international court and so forth. Multilateralism, however, is a lot broader. This is about solving problems in an open, transparent, non-discriminatory, and reciprocal way, according to John Ruggie, in a famous definition. So multilateralism is also about certain values, certain norms, that things have to be open, that countries need to be have equal weight, being similar, it's much more progressive than international institutions and international cooperation per se. So what we see is that international organizations are often bastions of multilateralism. For instance, many international organizations are stressing the need to be open, to be transparent, that states are equal. A lot of international organizations adopt liberal norms. They are driven by expert advice. For instance, the World Health Organization, the Corona crisis, very much trying to follow expert advice, trying to follow medical research in its approaches. So in that sense, they're really cornerstones of multilateralism, but they're not the same. One can imagine a world with international organizations, but without multilateralism. You can imagine a way in which cooperation between actors and states occurs, but not necessarily in an open, transparent, and non-discriminatory way. And I think this is important. So a crisis of liberal international order does not necessarily mean that we're going to abandon all the international organizations that exist. And those international organizations might operate differently according to different norms. But I think this is an important distinction, and it also might help explain why, for instance, the liberal international order might be in crisis, and some international organizations might actually really quite be resilient. So when looking to the future, I've just put on the slide a number of consequences one can think of, and you'll see a lot of question marks there because I don't really have many of the answers, but I think it's worth thinking of those points when it comes to the future of international organizations. So my first question is really, international organizations will likely continue to operate. If they survive the Second World War, they will be okay with the Trump administration, I reckon. But will they still operate effectively and in a multilateral way, in an open way, in a non-discriminatory way? Also, new international organizations might be established to reflect the hegemonic transition. And we already talked a bit about organizations where China is an important sponsor. Other question is, will new forms of international institutions continue to emerge? So Ken Abbott and Benjamin Fodor talk about low-cost institutions, so no longer the heavy household names like the European Union, IMF, World Bank, but rather very simple low-cost institutions, informal, not too many member states, not too much institutionalization, meet on an ad hoc basis to address international problems. Or will we actually see a return to formalized cooperation through international organizations? I mean, we've tried many of these type of low-cost private authority, NGOs, network governance type of approaches, and they really have not necessarily achieved the same type of effectiveness as what we were hoping for. So will we see a return to formalized cooperation for international organizations? What we see in general is that international organizations, particularly major ones, are really quite resourceful in dealing with these challenges. They're good at playing member states out against each other. They're good at fostering cooperation. They're good at making a case for expert advice. And I think we see really quite a lot of these things coming together in COVID-19 and the Corona crisis. If you think about the World Health Organization, but also, for instance, how security challenges are being dealt with in the Security Council and the UN more generally, or how the European Union is establishing new type of financial instruments to deal with some of the economic effects of the Corona crisis. Across the board, you see actually that international organizations continue to operate amidst the challenges of the coronavirus, and developing new type of initiatives and programs. So I think that resourcefulness should particularly not be underestimated. And in that sense, I'm also quite optimistic about how international organizations will weather some of the current crises of liberal international order. And I indeed think that the Corona crisis might lead to additional new forms of cooperation, both within existing international organizations, but perhaps we might find, establish new international organizations, one that perhaps is even more focused on pandemics than the World Health Organization, one that might sponsor vaccine research, and so forth. So I think this might also show us that there is still quite a future of international organizations among all these type of challenges. this already brings me to my conclusion, but before I do, I was wondering whether there are still questions.
Yes, there are. Someone is asking if you could perhaps say something about the cooperation of international organisations with large multinational companies.
Okay, I think that's a very good question. What's interesting here is that large multinational companies were one of the reasons why Cohen and Ney established their work in the early 70s about complex interdependence, and actually opening up the box of what states and societies are doing, because the traditional argument had always been of realists that in international relations it's just states that are the main actors and cooperate, and that states have interactions between them, intergovernmental interactions, and that other actors aren't particularly important. And I think that Cohen and Ney in the 70s, as a result of increasing globalization, actually showed how important multinational companies are, not just in talking to their own leaders, but also talking to foreign leaders and actually organizations. So I think this is part of that liberal institutional school to international organizations as it developed in the 1970s. And I would say that these days it's more important than ever. I mean, I might be wrong on the exact number, but I believe now that the United States has halted funding to the World Health Organization, the biggest donor to the World Health Organization is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So the World Health Organization is, kept together essentially by money that was made through Microsoft. What we've also been seeing is quite a lot of engagement by business leaders with international organizations directly. And I think there is a recognition here on the side of multinational companies that international organizations are not just often pursuing liberal policies, but are also pursuing evidence-based type of policies. So getting some of the politics out of it, which might be quite difficult for multinational companies to achieve on the national front. So I do think that these forms of cooperation will continue. I'm a bit more skeptical about all sorts of private authority coming up and companies self-regulating themselves, be it internet companies self-regulating themselves when it comes to privacy concerns, data concerns. I'm more skeptical there because some of these authorities are not necessarily ambitious in terms of what they establish in terms of regulation. There are compliance questions and so forth. So in that sense, I also believe more in the type of formal international organizations where states are the main drivers, where there's a headquarters, where policy gets made, and that needs to be implemented by countries, but also by companies.
Okay, great. And another question here. Of course, the cooperation of states within international organisations is dependent on the regime type of those states. With the rise of illiberal regimes in the midst of this COVID crisis, can we be sure that there will be greater cooperation within international organisations after this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important question. Does it matter whether the members of international organizations are democracies or authoritarian regimes? And what I think we've seen is that authoritarian regimes are also really quite capable in regional organizations of cooperating with each other. Actually, some research points to the direction that authoritarian regimes might live longer precisely because they cooperate through regional organizations. So it's not necessarily always, a positive thing that that cooperation occurs. But I think that's Good question, because we also know, particularly from the democratic peace literature, that democracies have a tendency of cooperating, that they have a broader outlook international, that they subscribe more to the type of multilateral values. But obviously the reality is that the majority of countries, particularly when it comes to population size, are full-fledged democracies, and I think that's something we need to deal with, and we need to consider. But I don't think that necessarily means that we can't cooperate internationally with a country like China. In fact, cooperation with China in the World Trade Organization has been really quite positive, and I'm not sure that there the domestic regime type ultimately plays a significant role. Actually, one can also make the argument that as a result of rise of populism and increasing engagement of national parliaments when it comes to international affairs, undermines cooperation attempts as well. It has been, for instance, very difficult for the European Union to agree to a number of trade agreements, for instance, with Canada, because national parliaments have been blocking some of these type of agreements. So I think that overall, while it might be easier for democracies ultimately to cooperate in international organizations, I don't think that regime type is as fundamental to cooperation within international organizations ultimately, and as some argue it is.
Okay, and we did have one more that came through. Okay, since the dominant ideology in the world since the 1980s and more especially 1990s has at its ideal a state with minimal fiscal and regulatory capacity, is the crisis of the liberal order merely the playing out of neoliberalism as a global doctrine?
I think that's really quite an excellent question, and I think that is also an interesting question to look at how international organizations have developed. What one notices is that, particularly in the 1980s, a number of international organizations have been dissolved, and particularly ones that dealt with cartel organization, natural resources, and so forth. So I do think indeed that the rise of private authority, the rise of a neoliberal agenda has had a significant effect on international organizations. The question here is whether some of the current crisis is just due to the contested nature of this neoliberal agenda, and I'm not quite sure it is. We've obviously seen major protests at G20, G7 summits along these lines. At the same time, we've also seen quite a bit of responsiveness of international organizations to some of those challenges. Think about the European Union, European Commission now pursuing a European Green Deal. Think about the European Union, previous European Commission, and trying to add a social dimension to Europe. Equally, World Bank having become a lot more environmental friendly over the years. So I do think that international organizations on the whole listen to these concerns. But I think the broader point, and I think that's also really raised by Michael Zürn, is that it's not just a neoliberal agenda which is key, but the very fact that there is something like international authority. If decisions are only made in Washington and Paris and Berlin, there's no need to go demonstrating for the European Union in Brussels or at the UN in New York. But the moment, obviously, that decisions are being made in Brussels or at G20 summits or in the UN or the World Bank, it also makes sense to start indeed demonstrating there and raising your issues in those places. And I think that's very much a part of this line of argumentation, that the rise of international authority, the fact that important decisions are now being made by international organizations, raises that contestation, and that can be both neoliberal, against the neoliberal agenda, but it can be also against other issues. So I think it's part of the current contestation, but I don't think it's fully the full explanation. What I suggest I do, because I have a look at the time as well, is that I move to the conclusion, and we can still see whether there's any questions afterwards. Let me see if I can get the next slide. There we go. So I talked really about three things when considering the future of international organizations. I went back to some of the conditions that help to explain the creation and development of international organizations, the problem condition, the cognitive condition, and the hegemonic condition. And really, when looking at the current situation, one wonders whether international organizations still get enough support through these conditions. In general, I think that we are currently in a state where international organizations are no longer seen as effectively solving all problems. And there's also reduced hegemonic support. And I think that really helps us explain why international organizations are currently in such a pickle, why there are these challenges. At the same time, also on the basis of historical evidence, I've looked at actually the long life of many major international organizations, and particular ones we know best, the household names, from the World Trade Organizations to the IMF to UNESCO, International Criminal Court. And they tend to really live long, and that they tend to weather the storm for three reasons. First, country states, actors want to avoid that there are gaps in global governance. So, if you disband one international organization, you're going to have to replace it with something else. And it's typically quite expensive to replace international organizations in terms of assets, functions, personnel. On top of it, you have in these major international organizations staff working day and night for the survival of their organizations, keeping the EU, the UN, Mercosur, what have it, keeping those organizations relevant. So actually, despite all the current talk about crisis of liberal international order, historically we've seen quite a lot of resilience of international organization. Now, when it comes to the current crisis, there tends to be quite a lot of agreement in the academic literature on the causes, what causes this crisis of liberal international order. And going back to the early 1990s, mid-1990s, as this is really where it started, this crisis. And it's quite surprising that both liberals, realists, domestic politics scholars point at the same type of causes, but there's very strong disagreement about the consequences and what this means for international organizations. And obviously, we're only a couple of years into this crisis of liberal international order, a couple of years into the Trump administration, the Brexit vote, and the rise of the emerging powers. So where are we going? But based on a historical perspective, I'm thinking that international organizations are going to be around well, and they might operate differently. It might not be according to the traditional liberal type of norms, the multilateral values, but I do think as platforms for cooperation, they will be around. So I think that's the conclusion. I think that's also the end of this webinar series. We've had 4 webinars so far. They will be soon available for you to download. I remain also at your disposal if you have any additional questions. On the last slide, there is my contact email address, which you can also find on my website. So please do reach out. Thank you very much for those of you who have been sitting through these 4 webinars. On the positive side, I do think it really covers the entire book. For those of you who just joined this session, feel free to look at the other webinars. Feel free to consult the book, and please stay in touch. And thank you so much for attending these webinars in these COVID times. I know it's difficult for all of us and for students particularly. So I hope this was useful to you in any way. So thank you very much.
I can see there are some messages coming through saying thank you to you as well, and just to echo that thank you. I know it takes a lot of time to put together sort of all the slides that you've covered with us in these 4 webinars, so thank you very much. There don't seem to be any additional questions at this time, so I think perhaps we can just wrap things up. So thank you once again, and thank you to everybody who joined this session. Bye, everyone.